On November 30th, 2018, former US President George H.W. Bush died at the ripe old age of 94. But it turns out, 26 years earlier, his death came within seconds of being announced to the world while he was still very much alive, after a random geriatric posing as Bush's doctor called in a fake tip to one of the now far too many fabric of society destroying 24-hour news networks. And while on any other day, a hot tip claiming that the President of the United States was dead would seem somewhat outlandish, just hours earlier, ABC News had broadcasted a video to the world showing the president in the most physically compromised position of his tenure. This is the story of when George H.W. Bush vomited into the lap of the Prime Minister of Japan and was almost publicly and erroneously declared dead. This story takes us to 1992, a now somewhat overlooked year in the pre-9/11 era, and even the pre-9/11 era, when Americans were just starting to catch on en masse to the fact that the world was becoming super connected while simultaneously rapidly unraveling.
I guess this is it.
1992 doesn't really get a lot of attention nowadays, but it was full of some pretty serious stuff. Like when thousands of justifiably outraged Los Angeles residents set the city on fire after the police officers that beat Rodney King to a pulp were unjustifiably acquitted, or when Cat 5 Hurricane Andrew took a vacation down to the Bahamas, Florida, and Louisiana to wipe out tens of thousands of buildings, kill 65 people, and cause the modern equivalent of $53 billion in damages, or when the largest shopping mall in the United States, the Mall of America, opened in Bloomington, Minnesota, taking up 7 Yankee stadiums worth of land in celebration of America's #1 pastime, unfettered overconsumption. But in January 1992, before all that fun stuff cropped up, the then US President George Herbert Walker Bush was kicking off the final full year of what would become a one-term presidency by embarking on a 12-day tour of Asia Pacific to reassess trade relations in the wake of the extremely recent dissolution of our Cold War comrades, the Soviet Union, only a week prior. He hit up Australia, then Singapore, then South Korea, and rounded it off with a 4-day stay in Japan. And it's on this last stop where things took a humiliating turn for the worse. On January 8th, 1992, on his second day in Japan, Bush attended a banquet at the Japanese Prime Minister's residence in Tokyo. Bush and the US ambassador to Japan, Michael Armacost, had played a doubles tennis match against the Emperor of Japan, Akihito, and his son, the Crown Prince, Naruhito. And Bush and the ambassador were bested by a pretty wide margin. I know that seems like an extraneous detail, but I promise it'll come back up in a little bit. After a bit of freshening up, Bush and his crew headed down to the dining hall to chow down before giving a speech to a crowd of 135 diplomats. And it's here where the real story begins. While sitting at the head table next to the then Japanese Prime Minister Kiichi Maezawa, Bush, having just finished his second course, begins to look a tad wobbly, and Maezawa, sitting to Bush's left, quickly picks up on the US president's droopiness. Then suddenly, Bush's head droops down while he starts to tip over. Maezawa leans in to steady his fall, and blammo, the President of the United States vomits into the lap of the Prime Minister of Japan. Immediately, First Lady Barbara Bush springs into action to wipe his chin and lean him upright, while the Secret Service seems to fumble for a few brief seconds. Bush, unconscious by this point, begins falling toward the floor. And this Secret Service agent is my favorite character in this whole thing. After gesturing for people to sit back down and remain seated, he briefly checks out his entry points before crawling over the table to assist in lifting the unconscious Bush back up. And then they just lay him right back down. It was about this time that Bush regained consciousness and reportedly said to Burton Lee, his personal doctor, "Roll me under the table until the dinner's over." For obvious reasons, they did not do that. Instead, Bush was able to stand up with some assistance, got a round of applause, waved to the crowd, and shook the Japanese Prime Minister whose lap he just vomited into's hand. Like, no hard feelings, eh? Then he was whisked away to receive immediate medical attention. In the absence of the US President, General Brent Scowcroft delivered the president's planned remarks, but he was introduced first by First Lady Barbara Bush, who used humor to make light of it. In her brief opening speech, she said, "You know, I can't explain what happened to George, because it never happened before, but I'm beginning to think it's the ambassador's fault. He and George played the Emperor and the Crown Prince in tennis today, and they were badly beaten, and we Bushes aren't used to that, so he felt much worse than I thought." It was obviously meant to be taken as a joke, and the reported laughter in the dining hall reflected that understanding. understanding. After all, the Bushes were known to have a sense of humor.
Kiichi Miyazawa, now handling the financial praise, the guy I threw up on over there in Japan. You remember him?
But I can't help but wonder how that statement, now printed in the official public papers of the presidents of the United States, made Michael Armacost feel. And as it turns out, he's 85 and still alive. So I emailed the only direct email address I could find at Stanford asking for a comment. But he left Stanford in 2021 and that email no longer works. So I emailed the Shorenstein A Park where he was a fellow in hopes that they could provide any up-to-date contact information. And I actually did receive a response from them, but they weren't able to give me any contact information for the dude. They just said that they would send him my information, so hopefully I'll hear from this dude just to kind of chat about what that felt like. Worth a shot. Moving on. The vomit incident was covered extensively in the international press. ABC News got a hold of the video and aired it, and Saturday Night Live even did a bit on it, recreating the video and commenting on it JFK mockumentary style. The incident was also covered at length in Japan, where they actually came up with a slang term for it, bushusuru, meaning to do a bush or do the bush thing. I don't know if that's still a commonly used or recognized phrase in Japan, but I'm really hoping that it is. The after effects of the George H.W. Bush vomit incident were felt for years, even finding their way into the Simpsons writing room in 1996.
I'll ruin you like a Japanese banquet.
And the incident was even referenced in the pilot episode of King of the Hill in 1997.
Detroit hadn't felt any real pride since George Bush went to Japan and vomited on their auto executives.
But there's a second part to this story, so let's rewind just a little bit. A few hours after the vomit incident, back in the US, there was a major story that came within seconds of being announced live on air. One that would have, if it were announced, inevitably led to grief and then confusion and ultimately mass anger. Just 3 hours after Bush fell, 24-hour news network CNN received a tip from a caller claiming to be Bush's personal physician that George H.W. Bush, the 41st President of the United States, was dead. And after a brief but heated debate, editors at CNN's sister station, CNN Headline News, raced to get it on air. On January 8th, 1992, at 9:45 a.m. Eastern Time, CNN Headline News anchorman Don Harrison began a sobering report. This just into CNN Headline News. And we say right off the bat that we have not confirmed this through any other source. Just then, a voice off camera yelled, "No, stop!" Harrison then, as smoothly as possible, corrected course. We are now getting a correction. We will not give you that story. It was regarding some rather tragic news involving President Bush. But updating that story, President Bush is reported resting comfortably. CNN Headline News had just dodged a massive bullet, having almost erroneously announced the death of the President of the United States. But how did that story nearly make it to air? Seems like a pretty heavy tip to not thoroughly vet, even in the face of Bush's recent illness. It turns out that the tip itself was called into the main network, CNN. Though the tip was ultimately considered a hoax by the main network and deleted in their system, their sister station, CNN Headline News, didn't receive the correction as quickly, and the pressure and even seeming obligation to report on such a massive news story clouded their due diligence. The editors had noticed the tip was no longer valid in the database after Don Harrison began reading the report on air, resulting in the off-camera shout to stop. So if this wasn't true, and the president was still very much alive, who called this in and why? The call ended up getting traced back to Garden City, Idaho, a suburb of Boise, and it was placed by a 71-year-old man by the name of James Edward Smith. Smith had been arrested the previous day, January 7th, for driving without a license or registration. But when police went to book him, he faked a heart attack and ended up being transported to a local hospital. And when the doctors realized that he did not, in fact, have a heart attack, the doctors ended up discharging him from the hospital, and he was never actually booked at the police station. That night, after getting discharged, he began making calls to a bunch of federal agencies claiming to be Bush's physician and also complaining about his recent arrest. And he called enough people that the agencies actually started to contact each other to see if other agencies had heard from this guy. And when they realized that he was calling multiple federal agencies claiming to be Bush's personal physician, they reported those phone calls to the local Garden City police. The next morning, on Wednesday, January 8th, Smith made yet another phone call, this time to CNN's tip hotline. But rather than complaining about his arrest the night before, he just claimed to be Bush's personal physician, alerting the media that the president was dead. Once CNN reported this call, local Garden City police arrested Smith a second time, where he feigned yet another heart attack. They rushed him to a local hospital again, but very shortly afterward transferred him to the Intermountain Hospital of Boise, a mental hospital, to undergo a psychiatric evaluation. A Secret Service agent did end up interviewing Smith, but no federal charges were brought. He did, however, catch charges for the license and registration violations. And I have to admit, James Edward Smith's motivation behind these calls is somewhat elusive with the very limited information that you can find on him. Now, this is just me speculating, and I have no direct evidence for this, but I find the most plausible explanation to be that he was suffering from some form of dementia or limited mental capacity at the time, especially since he didn't get any charges related to this activity. Couple that with the distress and possible confusion of an arrest that he may not have completely understood, and his bizarre behavior starts to make a little bit more sense. After all, he was 71 years old, and as it turns out, he was recently living in a VA retirement home in DC before going back out to Idaho. But again, that's pure speculation. He could have just been a geriatric troll hell-bent on pranking anybody within earshot. In November 1992, George H.W. Bush would ultimately lose his re-election bid to Bill Clinton. Not necessarily due to the vomit incident, though that didn't help, but for angering the GOP base in 1990 for being the one who raised taxes after infamously declaring in his 1988 campaign,
"And I'm the one who will not raise taxes."
Today, Bush Sr. is remembered for many things. Some good, some bad, but being president clearly has its perks. Because if you or I were the ones who vomited into the lap of the Prime Minister of Japan on international TV, that is almost guaranteed to be the only thing we'd ever be remembered for.